I'm David Ekers, and I'm going to just give a brief introduction today about behavioural activation. And we're going to have a bit of time at the end of this to think about it and for some questions to be asked. Unfortunately, these online talks aren't as interactive as we would usually hope. So please bear with me as I whistle through a number of slides and then pause at times to see if there's any comments. There is a chat function, and if you have any questions, you can put them into the chat function, and Karen's kindly agreed to keep an eye on that chat function because I can't see it while I'm in this mode. I think that's pretty much all we need to say as an introduction. We have now 50 minutes, so this is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. But hopefully it will help. The aim of the session really is to give you a brief outline of how behavioural activation for depression works, what it is, some of the evidence that we've collated as a research team that link to the Diadem and Impact programs, and then have a bit of a discussion about where next and how this is going to proceed through the various projects that we've got running. So we're going to think a bit about the theoretical background, some of the evidence of the effectiveness of BA, and really what BA looks like, which is why we're interested in it in these research projects. Okay, so behavioural activation. And one of the first things we want to think about behavioural activation is that it has a rationale for depression that may be slightly different to some of the other rationales that you're used to. So we have in the medical model, we have a view of depression as it's as a result of something that goes on in the synapses in the brain, and chemical levels get adjusted, and as a result, that causes depression. In cognitive therapy, we tend to think about depression as a result of thinking patterns, and when your thinking patterns change, the way that you interpret the world results in depression. The view in behavioural activation is that it comes from what we call a behavioural model, which relies on some of the theories of conditioning, and it views depression in the context of the world in which that person operates. And the principle of the intervention is that if somebody becomes isolated from things in their world that are important to them, and from a behavioural model, that means there are things in their world that provide them with a thing called positive reinforcement, and we'll come on to that a bit later. If you become isolated from positive reinforcement, that feels bad. So the behavioural theory sits depression firmly in somebody's relationship with their world. And if things then come along in their person's life to disrupt that relationship with the person's world, depression results of that. If you lose contact with those sources of positive reinforcement, all of us would feel a little bit bad. And I'm just going to start off, and those of you that have heard me do this talk before will have done this exercise before, but I think it's a useful exercise to remind us about how this works. And so just briefly, what I want people to do who are on the call is to list 5 activities that you do that are important to you in your daily life. So these aren't necessarily things that are always great fun. They might be, but they don't have to be. But they're important to you, and they give you a bit of a sense of who you are and your role in your world. So examples might be being in a loving relationship. It might be going to work and talking to your colleagues. But these are things that you do in your daily life. Doesn't have to be every day, that are important and give you a sense of who you are. So I'm just going to give you a minute to think about that and write those things down. The next bit of this exercise is going to be a little bit more tricky online than it might be in a big room with you all sat round. The next bit of this exercise is that I want you to think about those 5 activities And I want you to just spend about half a minute taking your mind back to when you last did them, what you were doing at that time. And I want you to almost take yourself back to the first person present tense as if you were there. And just for about half a minute to a minute, I want you to just sit quietly and put yourself back in that place when you were engaged in these activities. So what I want to do, I'm going to try and come out of share briefly to see if I can see people. I want you to use the chat function. And I want you to just write in the chat function, when you were doing that exercise, what feelings you got. How did it feel when you were putting yourself back into that place? So we've got warmth, fulfillment, relaxed, happiness, nostalgic. Thank you, everyone. Achieved. Good. Okay. Thank you. So generally, this is nice. So generally, when we are engaged with those things in our world, we generally feel okay, and we're not. I'm not seeking you to have complete self-enlightenment and hit the pinnacle of well-being there. But generally, if we're engaged well with things in our world, we feel okay. So I want you to think now. So the next bit of this exercise is a little bit different, and I want you to think, if something came along in your life, this might be illness, could be COVID, and the impacts of COVID. But if something came along in your life and meant that those 5 things and things like them were stopped, so you weren't doing them anymore, I want you to go back into that state. I want you to try and put yourself in a place where life carries on, but you are not able to do those 5 things and things like those 5 things. And I just want you to sit with that for half a minute. That's probably enough. And I want you to do the same. So in the chat, I want you to write, what were the feelings that you got when you were doing that exercise, that bit of that exercise? So we've got loss, sad, frustration, purposeless, empty. Thank you. Okay, thank you. So what we can see there is that this idea that if we become disconnected from the things in our world that are important and give us a sense of value or a sense of meaning in our life, and from a behavioral point of view, we would say that's kind of providing you with positive reinforcement. For any of us, if we become separated for that, for whatever reason that happens in our world, it changes the way that we feel. So this isn't something that is a deficit in people. This is a natural reaction to changes in our world and changes in the way that we connect with our world. So the last bit of this exercise is I want you to think about, if instead of doing those 5 things and things like the 5 things, if in that time that you used to do those things, what you actually were doing in place of that was sort of shutting down from the world, sitting isolated and churning over in your head the fact that you weren't doing those things anymore. What's that likely to do to the feelings that you have just described to me? The feelings like empty, fear, sadness. So if when you were cut off from the 5 things, what you were doing was sitting and thinking about not doing the 5 things, what's likely to happen to those feelings? And you don't have to sit with that. You can just start dropping those into the chat now. What do you think would happen the more you sat and thought about what you weren't doing? Yeah. So I think what we can generally see is that the more isolated that you become, the more you sit and churn over in your head, the more distant you are from those things in your world, so the worse that you feel, and the worse that you feel, the more you tend to shut down, and the more shut down you are, the worse you feel. And you get caught in this cycle, and it isolates you from your world and the things that are important in your world. So that is, in a sense, the basis of the understanding of behavioural activation, this contextual understanding that depression is sat not within us, It's not something that's wrong within us. It's something that has changed in our relationship with our world. So we see that depression as sat in that relationship with our world. Therefore, the focus of behavioural activation treatment is the change, the manipulation of that relationship with the world. So the focus of the treatment is about helping people plan to put themselves back in contact with things like the 5 things for you. So it's about helping people understand what they've become separated from and helping them then develop a plan to reconnect with those same things if that's possible. But if that's not possible, thinking about what things might give them a similar sense of positive reinforcement. So we have this rationale for depression. When we're connected to our world in a good way, we feel okay. When things come along that separate us from our world, that doesn't feel so good. So what we do in behavioural activation is we develop this understanding about how people's life's events have changed, their connection with the environment, and how this then develops into low mood for somebody. That's the first step of behavioural activation. We then help people think about how their pattern of coping with that, because often this shutdown behaviour is an attempt to cope with the bad feelings that people get, how that behaviour coping can explain how come their mood has maintained low, maintained the way it has, because people generally try to cope with what's going on for them. And then from that understanding, we developed a treatment plan which is aimed at changing the way people act on a day-to-day basis, changing what people do to reconnect them with their world in a way that's likely to deliver that positive reinforcement. And it's that resultant increased activation that then reduces depression symptoms. So the target of treatment is that activation rather than depression symptom reduction. We think depression symptom reduction is as a consequence of the activation. This stuff has been around for a long time, so it predates all the CBT stuff. So a chap called Skinner was talking about this, these ideas back in the 1950s, looking at depression as associated with a break from established sources of positive reinforcement. That is like what we've just explored in that experiment. If you become disconnected from your established sources of positive reinforcement, it feels bad. And then this chap Förster in the 70s started to introduce activity scheduling treatments, which showed a lot of promise in early randomized controlled trials. But then really the cognitive models overtook those in the 80s, and the behavioral treatments were largely forgotten for a while until probably the late 90s, when evidence started to show that they were looking very, very promising, and they were also perhaps much simpler to deliver than the cognitive interventions, which required a lot of training to become a competent cognitive therapist. So the key factors here are that depression is viewed as external to the person and as an understandable response in the context of people's lives. It looks at depression as a consequence of that person-environment interaction, and therefore it's that person-environment interaction which is the focus of the behavioural activation treatment. It still requires some strong therapeutic alliance, and it still requires you to engage a good relationship with a person, because this stuff's really difficult to do, because what we're asking people to do is, rather than wait to feel better to do things, which is what most of us do. We normally kind of wait until we're feeling well. We think, oh, well, when I feel a bit better, I'll get on and do that. In behavioural activation, we're reversing that. We talk to people about working from the outside in, actually doing something to help you feel better rather than waiting to feel better to do it. And that's a really challenging thing for people to get, because it feels so right when you're very low in mood to shut down and isolate. So the whole principle is change the outside and the inside will change. So this is the cycle that we have used, and we've sort of developed and worked on this across a number of trials over the past 15 to 20 years. We view a life event as fairly crucial, although it must be said sometimes when you get into therapy, sometimes those life events are really hard to unpick and isolate because they are quite a long time ago. But that life event, like we've just thought about in that first exercise, it results in isolation from somebody's valued activities. So we have this situation where something happens in your life and you become cut off from the valued activities. And as a result of becoming cut off from those valued activities, you feel bad. So there's a consequence of that. And we've just experienced, even just sitting here this morning, thinking about it, it feels bad. If people, what they do when they feel bad is that they think, right, I'm going to cut myself off and shut down because everything feels too difficult to face. What happens is they then cut themselves further from those things in their world that are useful for them and connect them with that positive reinforcement. And the further cut off from that you are, and where my little arrow is now, if you can see it, the worse you feel. The worse you feel, the more you shut down, you avoid things because that feels a natural way to cope, and you get caught in this cycle. That often results into other life events. So if people become too shut down, their friends stop coming to see them, or their relationship has problems, that then results in further isolation from the positive reinforcement. So we get caught in this cycle. And the whole idea of behavioural activation is to try and break this cycle. So break this arrow here, feeding back, and help people develop a plan that reconnects them with things in their world that give them a sense of purpose. So there's some behavioural principles in here. So positive reinforcement, and we could do a whole hour on operant conditioning, but just briefly, positive reinforcement, behaviours increase when it's followed by a positive state or a positive consequence. So if we do something and we feel right after it, we are going to do it more. We're going to repeat that behaviour, and it's not something necessarily you think about too much. It's something that happens. So that's a fairly key thing, and that's what we're trying to bring back into people's lives. Connection with things that give them a strong sense of positive reinforcement, because that increases their behaviour. The less positive reinforcement you get, the less your behaviours increase, the less you do. There's another really important thing here, which is negative reinforcement. Often when we're in a room together, we can kind of play about with this and see who gets negative reinforcement. The error that people tend to fall in with negative reinforcement is what they think is it reduces a behavior. Well, negative reinforcement doesn't. All reinforcement increases a behavior, but negative reinforcement increases a behavior because it is followed by the omission of something that is unpleasant in that moment in time. So it takes away a bad feeling. You do something and it takes away a bad feeling, therefore you do it a lot more. It's immediate and it's really powerful. And it's one of the real challenges that we have in the treatment of certainly anxiety disorders, but the more that we think about depression, it's really just as important in depression. So we go back to this cycle. So we have a life event, such as a physical health problem or whatever, but sometimes life events can also be a positive life event. But if the consequence of that life event is you become isolated from your valued activities, it leads to fewer things that give you that feeling that you got in that very first exercise, those 5 things that give you a sense of who you are. And what we know is that if we become isolated from those, we feel bad. And if to cope with feel bad, we attempt to cope by avoidance, what that can do is maintain the problem because you become further isolated from those things that can help you feel better. So we have this reduction here in positive reinforcement and avoidance behaviours that are negatively reinforced, so they increase and we get caught in this cycle. And that's what we're seeking to change in behavioural activation. So just thinking about a quick example here. So there's a chap called George who became ill with diabetes and heart problems. That was his life event. He became isolated from valued activities. So he couldn't do as much as he used to. He couldn't do as much at an allotment, which is a thing that we have in England when you haven't got a garden. You might have a plot of land where you can grow your vegetables. That's his allotment, and he used to be very proud of his allotment, but he couldn't get down there, so it was falling into a bit of disrepair, which made him feel bad. He couldn't go to the football with his friends. He had to reduce his alcohol intake, which was quite a social thing for him. He didn't see his friends as much, and he felt bad. Now, he felt bad because he was ill, but he also felt bad because his confidence dropped. He was doing less of the things that were good for him. And what he used to do to cope with that was when his friends come round, he didn't feel up to going out, so he'd make excuses. He stopped going to the allotment at all because he was ashamed of it. He hardly ever saw his friends. And as a consequence, his friends stopped coming round. And actually, some of his health problems got worse because he wasn't exercising or doing anything. So that was a cycle that George got in, and it kept going round, and he was very low in mood. And what we did in behavioural activation with George is we worked here. We understood this cycle firstly, and then through step-by-step activity, we got George to gradually start reintroducing behaviours that connected him with things like this, and resulted very well. Now, I'm afraid just because we started late, I think we're going to have to be very brief with this. So what I'd like you to do is I just want you to just spend a couple of minutes now thinking of somebody that you might know, thinking about how this cycle might relate to them, what might be their life events, and what might be the reduced positive reinforcement, or what might be the target of the behavioural activation for them. So just for a couple of minutes, I want you to just think about that. Now, you don't have to share that. I just want you to start trying to get your head into that. And when we get to the questions at the end, if you've got some questions, we can think about that. So I'm going to mute myself, and I'm going to give you a minute or two to do that. I'm going to talk probably now for about another 15 minutes, and I'm going to take you very quickly over some of the research that we've done on behavioural activation, and then hopefully that will give us 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the session to open it up and try to facilitate some questions and discussions. So does this stuff work? I think, as I said, for a long time, the ideas and thoughts about the behavioural treatments were really forgotten. There was an assumption that they were, too simple, and the more complex cognitive models were more effective, until this landmark study come along at the end of the 1990s by Neil Jacobson, who was actually interested in cognitive therapy, but having worked on a number of cognitive therapy studies, he noticed that cognitive therapy was made up of initially doing some behavioural activation based upon a cognitive model, but it was behavioural activation nonetheless. And then you would add challenging thoughts and challenging people's beliefs. And then you would, in the final stages of cognitive therapy, you go into working on people's core beliefs, the real core things that they tend to think. And what Neil Jacobson done was one of these component analysis studies where he broke things down into behavioural activation alone, activation and thought modification, and full cognitive therapy. And people were randomized to each of those arms. And what the randomization did is it equally distributed perhaps all of the other things that might impact on the outcome, which they measured as depression symptoms. And then he delivered the treatment, and there's lots of stuff in this study, lots of things written about this study to help you think about whether it was a good study or not. But basically what they found in this study was that at 6 months, there was absolutely no difference between the behavioural activation alone, the activation with the added cognitive thought challenging, or the full core belief work, which included behavioural activation, thought challenging, and core belief work. So at 6 months, there was no better improvement with the more complex treatment. Aha, said the cognitive therapist, but if you haven't changed core beliefs, what will happen is people will relapse more. So you'll get more kind of bounce back of the depression symptoms. So what they did is they followed up those people that had improved to 2 years, and they still found that there was no difference in the relapse rates between the treatment arms. So this really started the interest back in behavioural treatments. And it was following this study really, and following some of the challenges to the access to cognitive therapy, that myself and some of my colleagues, David Richards, Simon Gilbody, got really interested in behavioural activation and the potential of behavioural activation to be delivered by perhaps less, with less training in psychological therapies. If it's a more simple approach, hopefully we'd be able to train people much more quickly to deliver a good quality psychological intervention. And we published a systematic review back in 2008 and a meta-analysis. And what we found in that was, at the time, there were about 12 studies that compared behavioural activation with a control treatment, and about 12 studies that compared behavioural activation with the gold standard cognitive behavioural therapy. And what we found in looking at that is there was a large effect size in favour of BA when it's compared to controls, but no difference across studies in effect size when behavioural activation was compared to CBT. So Jacobson's study wasn't a one-off. It was something that appeared fairly consistent across studies. However, if you're familiar with these graphs, which some of you may be, what we saw was that the studies that made up these data were a lot of small studies, very small studies, in fact, and with a lot of questionable quality. And you can see here on this forest plot, the diamond down below here. The diamond indicates the combined results of all the studies. It's crossing the zero line, which says that there's no difference. At end of treatment and at follow-up, there was some sign that that was moving towards CBT. So there was potentially some sign that CBT might be a little bit better. What we decided to do then was to take out the dodgy studies, which is what NICE would recommend that you do some quality assessment, have a look at the good quality studies. There were far less of them. They were still pretty small, but what we see then is that diamond's going the other way. So then it starts favouring behavioural activation. So this led to quite a lot of uncertainty around those results that we'd observed so far. So we thought that there was some need for some further research, particularly because all of those studies used highly qualified therapists, and there were a lot of small studies of questionable quality. And actually, we weren't particularly interested in exploring another psychological therapy delivered by the same people. We were very interested in exploring a psychological therapy that can be delivered by people who are not specialist therapists. So we published our first pilot study of this in 2011 in the British Journal of Psychiatry. And what we found briefly was in this pilot was there was a strong sign at 3 months that BA, compared to treatment as usual, worked very well. There was a really big difference that we observed in this study. But it was a small study with short follow-up, so it was only really a gateway into doing bigger studies. And it led us to put in an application to the Health Technology Appraisal Group in the UK, which is funded by the National Institute of Health Research, to conduct a large-scale study of behavioural activation by a non-specialist compared to the gold standard psychological therapy, which it was at the time and probably still is, CBT delivered by accredited psychotherapists. And this was published in The Lancet in 2016, if you're interested in looking at it. It was a non-inferiority randomized controlled trial, and we were testing the clinical and cost effectiveness in a study of 440 people. And this was probably, well, I think it still is at the time, one of the largest studies of behavioural activation as a therapy, and one of the largest studies of CBT actually as a therapy as well. So a big randomized controlled trial. We included people with depression, and there were the standard exclusions from these sorts of trials. But what we got was really quite a range of fairly complex, quite severe depression with a lot of comorbidities. So we didn't exclude people with comorbidities, and we didn't exclude people with lots of anxiety disorders and the other things that we tend to see. BA was delivered by quite junior psychological wellbeing practitioners, and they're a group of people in this country who are employed to deliver brief treatments, but they don't have any formal psychotherapy training. CBT was delivered by qualified CBT therapists who had an accredited CBT qualification. These were either psychologists or nurse therapists who had done extensive further training. And both groups received equal amounts of protocol-specific training and weekly supervision with strong quality assessment. We looked at the primary outcome of depression using the PHQ-9 and a range of secondary outcomes, and we did our economic analysis at 18 months. So what did we find? Well, basically we found in this big study at 12 months, absolutely no difference whatsoever. So the BA worked just as well as CBT. In fact, it was almost identical. It was a very, very striking find. So not only did our mean fall within our non-inferiority margins, which were quite narrow. They were 1.92 points on a PHQ-9 scale. For those of you that know, that's a really quite a narrow margin. But not only did our mean fall within that, but the confidence intervals around our mean fell into that. So we were really quite confident about these findings. And what this meant was BA delivered by less experienced workers led to just as good clinical outcomes. But the cost effectiveness analysis also identified that this was about 21% cheaper than providing CBT. So really quite a strong finding. Excuse me. About the same time, we were doing a study. Our colleague Simon Gilbody was the lead on this study called CASPER, which was looking at collaborative care when the core of that was brief behavioural activation to prevent depression in older adults with subthreshold depression. And what was important in this study is that when we think about that BA cycle, one of the difficult things is that when people are getting old and frail, they're not able to do the things that they used to. So we brought in this whole idea of functional equivalence, which is where when you can't do something, you have to work really hard to find a new behaviour that gives the same sort of function as the old behaviour. And that's really important, we found, as we're going forward with studies of people who are depressed alongside a range of physical health problems. This was a big study with 705 people over 65 with subthreshold depression, which is the major risk factor for progression to full depression. But even in that subthreshold group, where it's really difficult to detect a difference, we found that BA-informed collaborative care resulted in reduced depression symptoms at 4 months and 12 months compared to usual care. So this was a striking finding, and more striking, we thought, really, was that when we looked at the chances of going on and getting full depression at 12 months, this was about halved in the collaborative care, the BA group. So really quite a strong finding there. We did, alongside both of these studies, we did quite a lot of process evaluation and talked to people about what seemed to go well. And some of the key messages out of that are, we need to keep to the model. We don't stray into other models, cover the core elements of behavioural activation, and make sure that you add a bit of relapse prevention. So the stuff that's gone on, there's just recently been a couple of new Cochrane reviews that have been published in this area. So they're new this year. So you can have a look at those and we can make those available. What we know is depression is a great challenge across the world. This is particular in older adults. And what we've seen from our research is that BA appears to be very strong, but also effective when you train non-specialists to deliver it. And that's why we've taken it forward in our new studies. just briefly what it looks like. So this is a study from our MODS program in the UK, which is looking at people over 65 who have multiple long-term health conditions. We create a booklet that we give to people, which takes them through behavioural activation, and then our therapists phone up and talk them through it. It uses 3 stages that build on top of that rationale that we got, that cycle. We help people understand that, and then we get people to monitor themselves, so what they're doing and how they're feeling, and start to recognise the patterns there, to break down those things through a thing we call functional analysis, which is a complicated way of just saying we look at specific incidences and look at what went on before, during and after, and what the impact of that is, and then help people start to make plans working from the outside in. So not waiting to feel better to do things, but doing things to help you feel better. So we look at R2D2 helps us in this area. So we look at reinstating previous behaviours that perhaps have dropped away, if that's possible, or replace old behaviours with new behaviours if the old behaviours aren't possible. We disrupt unhelpful patterns of behaviour, and we decrease avoidance behaviours. So I apologise for whizzing through that and my technical problems at the start. But I think that is what we will end on here, and that gives us 10 minutes for some question and answers if people have any.
So I have a question regarding the rationale that you have for BA. I was wondering, like, how is it different from the rationale that we have for logotherapy developed by Viktor Frankl? How is it different?
For what therapy, sorry?
Logotherapy, like providing the meaning to the life.
Do you know what? I don't know that therapy. It sounds like it might be fairly similar if that therapy is working on that behavioural principle, which is about reintroducing positive reinforcement. So I'm not so sure about that. So I couldn't particularly answer that, but it sounds from your question that you think it's pretty similar.
Yes, well, the main rationale behind that was like to give meaning to the life, that that we have some meaningful activities that we like to do. If we have the meaning, we will be fine. So I think it's probably overlaps with BA and with logotherapy, probably.
It certainly sounds like it, and that's what we're doing. So there's this idea that it's not just any behaviour that you get people to do, it's behaviours that are important to them. And that, if we go back to that first exercise, you know, that was one of the key things, that if you stop doing behaviours that aren't important to you, it's not going to change particularly how you feel. It's the behaviours that are important to you that drop out of your life that are important, and therefore that's the target of BA.
All right, thank you, David.
I enjoyed that talk, and it's really helped put the whole study into context for me. I've got 2 questions. So the first is, to what extent has behavioural activation been used in people with diabetes before? Because there are obviously specific challenges for managing depression in the context of diabetes. And then the second question, which is more UK focused really, is just to ask, to what extent is behavioural activation available through IAPT services? And I can see that somebody says, what's IAPT? So that's the increasing access to psychological therapies, which is the way that a lot of psychological services are commissioned within the UK.
Okay, so I'll take those one by one. And I used to be the clinical lead for a big IAPT service in Durham. So I'm familiar, but a little bit out of date. That was some time ago. Karen has just...
Maybe I can help with that one.
Yeah, Karen has just come out. So tell her, you correct me if I'm wrong, I think behavioural activation is available through IAPT services as one of the menu of choices of psychological treatments, both at a low intensity and a high intensity level. I'm not sure particularly what materials that they use. And we did approach IAPT after our COBRA study and offered to share our treatment manuals and training with them, but they didn't take that up. at all. Karen, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, behavioural activation is absolutely sort of a mainstay of one of the treatment options within IAPT. We offer treatments at 2 levels within our IAPT services. So we work to what's called a step model of care. So a low intensity treatment would be what we would call guided self-help. So that is a practitioner with less training would work with the depressed person to use behavioural activation. So they act more in a coaching role, really, to help the person use the materials, make their own decisions about what kinds of activities they're going to try and bring back into their life and reconnect with. Sometimes behavioural activation is used with the cognitive behavioural therapists at a more intensive form of treatment for people who are really struggling to recover from their depression. But they may be bringing in other elements as well. So they may be bringing in some cognitive elements there. So as Dave's already alluded to, a person's core beliefs may be about why they're depressed or why they're struggling. So the intervention tends to be a bit more blended there. But certainly at the low intensity, the guided self-help, it would be used in its purest form, as Dave has described it during the presentation.
And I think, thanks, Karen, that's really helpful. And I think there's a real discussion there about that need for blending therapies. So in COVID, we were working at that higher intensity level, and our CBT therapists could do all that core belief work. Our behavioural activation therapists didn't. And what we observed in that study, really interestingly, was about an 80% recovery rate. And that 80% recovery rate was maintained to 18 months, pretty much. So really good outcomes and really long maintenance of gains when people stuck to the treatment mode that they are given. So I think that, you know, both of these treatments worked really well in that study, but you didn't need to blend them. And that's some of the discussion. It might be a kind of bit of a mute discussion in routine care, but what we would say is that you don't have to add those other elements to behavioural activation to make it as effective. In terms of diabetes, I think off the top of my head, I can't think of the names of studies. There are a number of studies out there that have been done, and also in our studies where we tend to include people with a range of multiple health problems. So in CASPER, we had a good number of people with diabetes, and in MODS, we're certainly seeing that. So I think there's a good case, but I think Diadem will give us a really good chance to look at how we can address these things together, these 2 problems together in a range of different settings. So that's a little bit of a dodger to your question, Richard, because I can't think off the top of my head what those studies are.
Thank you.
Dave, there's a couple of other questions. Are there public mental health opportunities to prevent depression in a situation such as a pandemic? And also from asking about whether depression is more irreversible when you have these external incidents, environment changes, such as loss of income. And I suppose the pandemic as well. But
okay, thanks. Yeah. So we're actually running as part of the MODS program, we're running a study at the moment looking at delivering behavioural activation to people over 65 with health problems who are socially isolating as a result of the pandemic. So that's a study that was given urgent public health. I think there were 2 mental health studies that got urgent public health status. This is one of them. We haven't got results from the study yet. We're just moving into the full RCT from a pilot RCT of that. So we'll see how that goes over the coming months, particularly with the rollout of the vaccines. But what we're seeing in the pilot phase of this study is a really strong ability to recruit to this study. So people wanted to take part and a really good engagement with the treatment sessions. We haven't looked at any of the outcome data yet, but there is also some early sense coming out of talking to people about the study that people have valued it while going through the pandemic. In terms of public health I think that's a really interesting question. Another study that we finished last year was using BA through community pharmacies in the UK. So community pharmacies do a lot of smoking cessation advice, weight advice, dietary advice, sexual health advice. So we trained a number of healthy living practitioners who are pharmacy workers to do brief behavioural activation, and we tried to run a randomised controlled trial. The intervention take-up was really quite good, and engagement with the intervention was really quite good. We struggled hugely to recruit in that study, so we're not able to take that study to a full trial because recruitment was so challenging. But the qualitative side of it certainly gave a sense that the intervention could hold promise there if we could work out how to run a trial. And in relation to, I think, the question about when there are significant life events that are really difficult to resolve, we come across that quite a lot. And of course, it's really, really difficult, which is where I think the treatment rationale and helping people understand the treatment rationale becomes really important. And that idea of functional equivalence. So BA isn't just about redoing the things that you used to do. It's about recognizing what the things that you used to do would give you. So that meaning that we were talking around a little while ago, and then thinking about what alternative behaviors are possible that might give you some, if not all of that level of positive reinforcement back. So it's kind of problem solving and working out what is possible given the range of situations. And that's really important when we come along to people that are challenged by quite pressing physical problems. And that's always one of the real skills, I think, of delivering interventions like this, is about applying it to those different settings. Don't hesitate to drop me an email, and I look forward to working with you as the programs move forward. I'll hand over to you, Najma, to just close the session.
Okay, just to say thank you very much, Dave, for that excellent talk, and but really appreciate you giving your time, Dave, and doing this. Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining.